Hello and good afternoon, or good morning, or good night, whatever time of day it is for you. My name's Diana, and this is That Girl's Quilting Threads and Things. This is a channel where I try to share with viewers like you tips and tricks that I've learned along my way growing in my quilting journey. So today's project is all about free motion quilting. This will be a very simple journey on how I get my quilt ready for free motion quilting and how I go through the process. I'm not a professional. This is just how I learn to do things. So if you have tips or tricks on how to improve the techniques, I welcome your comments in the comments section below. But for now, I'll see you at the sewing machine. Now there are a lot of ways out there that you can do quilting. You can do free motion quilting. A lot of people will do this, especially if they're gifted in thread art. You can do a nice tight pattern inside of your project. Maybe you're able to free draw with your quilting. You can use things if you're not that great at eyeballing and getting very symmetrical designs. They have these great things out there called quilting rulers. They have a nice wide, maybe a 1/4 inch thick piece of hard plastic or acrylic, and you can use a specialized ruler foot that will go along the sides of this, allowing you to trace the pattern of the quilting stencil. And they come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. Like this one here might be really good to use for an edge. They often have measurement designs on them to help you keep your proper distance. You can also use these great quilting stencils. So there is you can take some chalk powder and you can draw the pattern. Some of the things also that you want to think about when you're free motion quilting is fabric control. So there are a number of things that I do. I like to use these quilting gloves. They have a nice texture on the tips of the fingers, and they are nice and elastic, and they're thin so they don't feel too bulky. So I also found these gloves. They have a nice texture throughout the whole glove itself. So they've got little rubberized grippy dots. And what these do is when I'm free motion quilting on my project, those grips allow me to move symmetrically and move the fabric as I want it to flow. Another inexpensive idea is that you can go to your local hardware store and you can just simply get these types of work gloves. It just depends on what works best for you and what is most comfortable. I am trying this Martinelli quilting hoop today. So what this is it's a really super hard acrylic or plastic that has handles on it, and it also has a grip underside so that when it sits flat on your quilt, you can grab the two handles and you can move them around with your project. And it helps you focus on just what's inside of the hoop, and it helps keep that portion of your quilt nice and flat. In the past, all I've pretty much done is free motion quilting, and I've done either a meandering pattern, kind of where you're just making like puzzle type shapes, if you will, or I've done some loops around so that it's just uniform and I am just doing a basic free motion quilting. There are other ways that you can do quilting as well. If you have a machine that does embroidery work, in some cases you can find patterns, and they call it edge-to-edge quilting. Maybe on my next project, I think I'll give that a try. Now there are a number of different feet that I can use on my quilting machine. It depends on the machine itself and the feet that come with it, but there are a lot of standard feet as well out there that will go across different machines. So I think earlier we talked a little bit about this ruler foot here. So it has a small opening for the thread to go in and out, and you can use that. So you want to pay attention to the kind of shank that you have. Is it a high shank or low shank or some other kind of specialized fitting? This one here is an open-toed foot, and this is what I'm using today. So as you can see, there is no closure on that foot. So let me go ahead and get set up and let's get started quilting. Most of my projects have been quilts that are roughly a little bit larger than lap size, twin size, or even a few queen size. I have a small extension to my sewing table that goes out about another foot, and it's only on this side of the desk. And one of the things that I've learned is that when I'm quilting a project and I'm trying to move around and the fabric is moving and whatnot, I tend to get a little tweaky. So one of the things that you want to consider is having a place where your quilt can rest while you're working on your small area. Another thing is something that we've already mentioned, which was the gloves. So I will wear these gloves while I'm quilting to help me grip the fabric. And these gloves have those rubber tips on them, so they grip the project nice and firmly. But I also have these handles on this quilting hoop, so this is going to help me maneuver it around a little bit better, in theory. Something else that you want to do is when you are pushing your fabric and moving it around on the quilting machine, sometimes we forget about staying upright with our back and our posture, relieving that stress in our mid to lower back. And so one of the things that I try to do is I try to bunch the quilt up right up against my chest, and I try to scoot as far forward as possible so that the quilt doesn't droop down and then all of a sudden I've got it pinched and I'm trying to push forward. Another thing that I see quilters do is they will roll up all of the loose areas of the excess quilt in order to, 1, keep it nice and straight, 2, keep it up onto the table, and 3, help keep you focused on just the part that you were working on right then and there. If you do not have your quilting table pushed up against a wall, you can put chairs on the far side of your desk so that when you are quilting the lower portion of your quilt, and as you push your project forward and forward and forward, it doesn't all of a sudden droop down on the other side of your table, causing unnecessary pull and tension, which could distort or tweak your project. So I think that's about it for for my experience on what I've learned so far in quilting. But I'd really love to get your feedback as well. So I have the settings on my quilt project. I have it set in a quilt mode stitch. The first thing I want to do is I want to drop the needle and work on bringing up my bobbin thread. And I'm actually starting in the center of my ring. I've got plenty of space. Another thing, you want to adjust your speed to your needle speed, however it's easiest for you. And think about when you're practicing your quilting before you start a project, see how fast you want to move the fabric so that you get the desired and uniform stitch that you're hoping for. Right. This seems to feel pretty good. I like this. And all I'm doing is a simple meandering pattern. Now when I come to the edge over here real close to the needle, I need to shift the hoop, so that when I shift the hoop, I'm also making room for more. making sure that I have my project nice and flat, because this is going to help make sure that I have a nice flat, as close to pucker free quilting. So I've shifted it a little bit. All right, keeping it up there and tucked. Now I did start in the center or close to the center of my quilt so that as I quilt it, it keeps a nice uniform lay between the top, quilt top, the batting, and the backing, and I work my way out towards the edge. Make sure that when you are quilting that you just take your time. It's not a race. Slow is smooth, smooth is steady, steady wins the race. I do like the handles. They help me move the fabric a little bit better. So I'm going to continue on my quilting, and I'll meet you back here when I'm all done. All right, I finally got it all quilted. I used the 8-inch quilting hoop for the whole project. So I did a basic meandering. A couple things about the quilting hoop. For one, this tool here, couple things I noticed is that this opening right here, it could be bigger. I had to remove the quilting presser foot, put the hoop under the needle, and then reattach the quilting presser foot, which kind of made a little bit harder for me to kind of work it underneath the sewing machine once this hoop is in there. Another thing is that these holding knobs, they're really good. I really did like it. It made it less stressful to hold the knobs and move the quilt around than placing my hands and trying to move it around. So the tension and the fatigue endured was much less. However, these these knobs here, they overlap the opening by about 1/2 inch. And when you consider the area around your presser foot, you still have to accommodate for that. Also, the quilting footprint is not a full 8-inch, right? Because you still have the mechanics of your presser foot to compensate around here. So really it's about a 6-inch hole, a 6-inch diameter area where you can quilt. So I did have to get used to lifting and moving and removing any tension out of the quilt so that I had a nice flat surface and didn't create a whole lot of puckers. Overall, I think I'll continue to use this. My last observation on this is this gripping band, while it is excellent for the grip, it did start to come off the hoop itself, so I'm going to have to figure out something to keep that more permanently attached. If it ever comes off completely, I think it will be easy to replace that material that you can use to line your shelves, that grippy stuff that you can use to line your shelf. Create a template around it, just re-glue it on there, so this isn't a make or break. Overall, I think I enjoyed this. It was much easier to do this. I'd say it took me about between 6 and 7 hours to quilt the whole quilt top. So after we've got the quilting done, the next thing that we want to do is we want to trim off the extra batting and backing. And we also want to make sure that we have a nice squared up quilt. There are a lot of ways that you can do this. It's really whatever is going to work best for you. But as part of what I like to do is I just want to share how I learned to do certain things. When I was learning to quilt, I did a lot of YouTube watching. But what I was missing is how people cope with little mistakes that happen for everyone, little offsets and things like that, and how to work in small spaces. Now, granted, I think I have a pretty decent space compared to a lot of other people, but I also have a very small space compared to a lot of other people. So I thought I would just share with you how I square up a quilt after I've got it all quilted. I'm working right here in about 26 inches wide by about 3 feet in depth. So my goal is I've got to cut off all this excess batting and backing, and I've got to make sure that my quilt is square so that the seams don't wander and wave, right? So there are different things that you can do. You can take, if you've got a large ruler like this one here, this is a 12.5-inch square ruler. This is a great way to start off to make sure that your edges are at a 90-degree angle. 12 inches is a good amount of space to do that because that's a whole foot on either side. You can get a nice right angle from that. If you don't have a large square ruler, you can also use a wide ruler like this one here. This ruler here is 24 inches long, and it is 8.5 inches wide. That's not 12 inches, but I still think that it's been very helpful for me to be able to get a nice straight line on my ruler this way, and then using the edge and creating that nice right angle. And this is how I do it most of the time. You can take and line up the edge of your quilt, maybe with a known landmark. Make sure that it's nice and straight, and then you can slide that all the way over, keeping your landmarks in place. I don't recommend using this edge here as a landmark for straightness, because as you quilt, you may stretch a piece of your edging. You'll stretch the edge of your quilt, and so it may be a little wonky. As a good example, I might use this here. I know that these blocks are 6 inches wide. So I'm going to make sure that I have my line on this edge and my line on this edge. I'm going to make sure that it's straight, and then I'm going to take and slide that over. So I feel like I could do it that way, and then I would cut along the edge. Another thing that you can do if you have wide enough space is you can take and add a second ruler. So if I don't have a 12-inch ruler or a 15-inch square ruler, well, I can use 2 of my rulers. I can butt them together, making sure that my inch metric lines are lined up, and then I can just make sure that that's nice and straight, and I can cut up that way. So that's another way. I have this 24 inches to work with, which means that the bulk of the quilt is hanging off the table. So I will use this ruler here for most of my quilt cutting and squaring up, because to me it's wide enough, I'm comfortable with it, and it works well. I will just kind of hand flatten my quilt, whatever lays on my cutting mat, and then I will take and use my measurements up there. So I'm going to take 2 1-inch, 2 of my lines here, but because my outer border is approximately 2 1/4 inches, I'm going to take my inch measurement line here, making sure that it's on there. I'm going to give it a visual look here to make sure that this inch line is even on this border, so about the same distance, and it's not all wonky, right? And then because my border is right now, it's at 2 1/4. So I'm going to have my 1/4 inch line at the top. So you can't see the whole thing because the camera won't catch it all. So now that my line is straight and I've got my 1/4 inch line running as parallel as I can, again, part of the quilting process, if you can tell, my border wings out a little bit. So I kind of just eyeball and compensate it as best as I can. And then once I've got that, I'll make my first cut, making sure I've cut all the way through. And then I'll take that up. Now I'm not going to pull it all the way out. That will distort how my quilt is laying on the cutting surface. All right. Then I will, with both hands, I will pull and I will drag down. Now once it's dragged down, I got to kind of maneuver around a little bit. So I'm going to straighten out my quilt again on my cutting surface, making sure that as much as I can get on the table is on the table, nice and straight. And then I will hand press, make sure that it's nice and as flat as can be. And then I'm going to take the edge of my ruler, keeping my same landmarks, and I will make sure that my 1/4 inch line, because again my border is 2 1/4, and I will make sure it's lined up nice, and then I will continue my cut. So as I'm looking at this, this should be nice and flush with the part of the ruler where I've already cut. And continue cutting. So you'll take a few passes as you cut each edge of your quilt, and you just take your time, keeping your eye on the same landmarks that you use, keeping your quilt nice and straight as best as you can. 1/4 inch mark there, 1/4 inch mark there, and it's still nice and flush. All right, we're coming up towards the edge. 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. Once I've made my cut to the edge of my quilt, I just go all the way off. All right, so we have a nice straight edge on one side of our quilt. The next part makes it a little bit easier. You just have to compensate as best as you can given the space that you are working in. So now that I have a nice smooth edge that's even to work with, the rest of this should cut smoothly. Now I can take my inch metric line here, and I can use that as my landmark to make my first cut. But I will still make sure that I have my 1/4 inch line matching up as well. So remember, we're creating a right angle on this quilt. I have it all lined up. Everything looks good. And I will make my cut on the second side. And again, fold that up. And then I'll continue the process. Okay, so one more time, we're on our final side here. Now that we have that nice straight edge right here that we can work from. And I also know my 1/4 inch line is also lining up here. So I know I'm in good shape. Then I want to make sure that my 1/4 inch line here, because right now my border is at 2 1/4 inches. So I want to make sure my 1/4 inch line right here and at the end of my ruler is lined up. All right, once I've done that, I'll go through here and I'll make a cut, and I'm starting my 4th side. Grab your quilt and slide it down. Lightly press it out to make sure that it's straight and flat. Nice firm hand. Everything is flush. Repeat the process. All right, so that's how I do my quilting process and how I square up my quilt. I'd love to get your feedback on how you square your quilt up in the small areas that maybe you work in. All that's left now to do for this quilt is to calculate the binding, piece it together, and attach that binding to the quilt. But I think I'm going to save that for another video. So until the next one, may all of your quilting journeys be joyful, one stitch at a time.